For visa reasons. It's also allowed to be in the country.
How does it work?
Normally with the arrow.
On the side, yeah. The other side, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Hello. Good morning again. Thanks, Plus, for the invitation and for maintaining this process. A special thank you for my partner in crime here. I don't know exactly why I was asked to do this. Maybe because none of the authorities have enough money to send representatives to the group, but I welcome the opportunity to revisit this issue, which I must confess had been detached from for some years. Now, I am going to do this through looking at the three environments which have been recently, in the past time, affecting the decision-making, particularly in the United States. I'll try to show the links between them. I'll try to show the inputs which were put into the decision-making, and then I will come to some conclusions or tentative conclusions. So let's start with Disney World. You know where this place is. And I want to remind you, and this is a very early paper from Mike Bush. This was very early on in his career. But I want to remind you of the importance of the donor selection part, which at that time was the only part of the blood safety paradigm in relation to minimizing the HIV epidemic in recipients. And this, as I said, is an analysis done by Mike, and it is old enough for to have had Dr. Perkins, the late Dr. Perkins, in the paper. And basically what this shows is that if you look at this curve of the risk of HIV per unit transfused, it shows the effect of the first deferral measures before there was testing, let alone viral activation, which is what affects our community. And the important point to note here, look at this dotted line. This is the projection which Mike modeled at that time as to what would have happened if the deferral measures based upon donor selection were not affected. So through the introduction of the deferral measures, we got immediately a lowering of the risk, but if they hadn't introduced this, the risk would have been gone up and up. So as of this time, in the early 80s, there is no question that the risk of HIV transmission for the transfused community, not for our community, was significantly and greatly decreased through the introduction of deferral measures. And this is the historical progression. Many of these slides are extracted, I might confess, with some difficulty, because the FDA doesn't have the money to put its presentations on its website anymore, so you have to look at the webcasts and take notes. But this is extracted from the BPAC of 2015, and this is the progression, the historical progression of measures. And so you first had the permanent deferral involving sexually active or bisexual men with multiple partners. This then went to a more rigorous process in relation to even one sexual encounter, and this then progressed in terms, I think, just of vocabulary between male and men, and was inoculated into the donor, into the current donor history questionnaire to include any assertive indication to the question from 1977 to the present, have you, male donors, had sexual contact with another male even once? So you will see that further on I will refer to MSM 77, and that's what we mean. Okay, bye-bye. Now, as a result of, let's say, political progression involving as its main leverage or pressure point the Blood Safety and Availability Committee of the Department of Health and Human Services in the United States, several meetings on this issue, leading to them recommending to the Secretary, important to note, not to the FDA, but to the Secretary, that the policy gets relaxed. And this happened, I believe, people here in this room are familiar with these processes, they're part of them, Mark Skinner and so on. This happened about early 2014, and the FDA obviously knew that it had to digest this recommendation and came up with the guidance which you see over here a little over a month ago. And I always like to point out, because even in the 15 years that I spent as a regulator, 10 of which were at a senior level in which I interacted continuously with my then counterpart and always very close friend, Jay Epstein, I was always partly amused, but also increasingly envious of the fact that the FDA could make a statement about guidance and not legally enforceable, but reflecting current thinking. I can tell you that once I made a presentation for the TGA in Australia, and I said, this is the TGA's current thinking, and I was hauled up in front of the Deputy Minister and said, nobody is interested in what is your current thinking, because it's not reflected in law. But the FDA apparently is able to tell people that it can exert measures without them being legally enforceable. That's just a bit of personal prejudice. Now, in this guidance, first of all, you know what the guidance came up with. It is a change in policy from permanent deferral to 1 year since the last sexual encounter. So I don't want to start making dubiously amusing remarks, but I always puzzled at the extent to which people think that people will be sexually abstinent for even a month, let alone a year, if they are sexually active, for the privilege of donating blood. But irrespective of that, this guidance is actually the reason why I decided to accept this invitation, because it is a long way and it is quite an expensive trip from my then location. But I read the guidance and I said, geez. The guidance claims that it drew upon its conclusion from several inputs based upon scientific analysis, and I'm going to go over some of these to the extent that I feel they're important. And one of them is the REDS-2 study, extremely important, and there are several papers. This is one of them from Brian Custer, and you can see over here the adjusted odds ratios for donors who were found upon the current available screens to have HIV infection. Now, it's quite interesting. What I've extracted here, again, not easy because the tables are enormous, and I've just extracted the ones which have significant differences. Okay, so what you can see here are the groups in which you have, relative to baseline, a significantly higher odds ratio of HIV infection. Okay, so what we're interested here, really, for the purposes of this talk, is the second metric, which is MSM, or sex with MSM ever, in reference to never. And you can see that the adjusted odds ratio is significantly high. In fact, it is only second in size to the very obviously predictable higher risk of sex, actually, with an HIV positive partner. Now, I just make, I'll make some comments. I found this analysis quite interesting. First of all, a lot is said, especially in the European environment, which I shall come to in the second half of my talk. A lot is said about discrimination in relation to sexual practice. Okay, and why aren't we doing the same thing in relation to heterosexual promiscuity? All right, well, you can see here that on the basis of actual risk, it's a very different kettle of fish. Okay, it is as simple as that. If you've had multiple partners over the last year, relative to monogamous, the odds ratio is doubled, whereas with MSM, it is 60 times as much. So let's get this clear. MSM relative to heterosexual promiscuity is 30 times more risky. This is why the focus was on this practice. It is as simple as that. It is based upon epidemiology. What also intrigues me in this analysis, and remember, we're talking about things for which we have already selection procedures. Look, for example, at body piercing. This is something which makes the plasma industry irritable because it's one of the least policeable and enforceable of the deferral measures. It's a pain in the neck, and yet, you know, we do have nearly 3 times the level of risk. So maybe there's something in it after all. And then, of course, I don't want to comment about the elephant in the room, but observe here. Nobody so far has made one comment about this. But observe here, and there is a relevance there, a historical link to another blood safety environment, which I'll touch on very briefly overall. So,
what's NH?
non-Hispanic.
Non-Hispanic, okay.
Black but non-Hispanic. You know, Americans are fixated on issues of race, and they always include questions of race, American publications. But I think it's interesting. Now, I'm mentioning these papers because these are the inputs. It's specifically stated in this guidance that these were the inputs. And when they had the BPAC, which was a bit over a year before the publication of the final guidance, these data were first presented. And if you look at the webcasts, the meeting started, Mark Skinner will remember this, with an excellent presentation as usual from Alan Williams, and you could detect, because you can see the webcast and you can hear it, you could detect the unease and anxiety in his voice as he progressed the discussion. The other input is the so-called blood drops study. This is a fascinating study published very recently in Transfusion as 2 separate papers. This is the one which is kind of more interesting in terms of quantitative analysis, again written by Brian. And you can see these are donors who subsequently admitted to complying or non-complying with MSM 77. And you can see the breakdown here. And again, I extracted purely and simply the ones where there were significant differences. And you can see between the different aspects and the different sexual practices. And I think it is very clear that the bulk of people who are not complying are coming from relatively high levels of sexual practice. But the important thing is this: these guys were not complying. There was a mechanism, it was in place, it was one of the very basics of the blood safety paradigm for at least transfused recipients. Many people just didn't give a damn. Oh, well, that's actually a bad way of putting it. I do retract that statement, because you will see that there are reasons that people do self-assess. Now, this is again, these numbers are extracted from the guidance itself, and you can see that US blood donors reporting MSM have increased over the 2 decades since we had formalized the questionnaire in relation to the practice. This is a very common phenomenon, and I will show you data from one of my countries, because I've got many countries. And I'll show you some data from one of my countries. Because, intriguingly enough, and very unusual for the FDA or for any American institution, one of the inputs which they drew upon in relation to changing the policy was, believe it or not, what happened in Australia. We were so chuffed. Anyway, so there you go. It is definitely increasing. Now, here is, again, blood drops, a complex slide. I recommend strongly perusal of the publications. The reason why I put on the slide is that this is one of the linchpins stated by the FDA for their consideration of a change in policy. I do not believe that this is the case. The FDA here, like any regulatory agency, had to conform to the political societal imperative, and that's the only reason for the FDA or any regulator to pretend that they're changing policy in order to align more carefully to the science, or even, as is stated in some statements by regulators, to decrease the risk, is, in my opinion, totally incorrect. Regulators, I was one of them for many years, are subject to the same political governmental pressures as any other government agency. And this is what has happened in this instance. This is the result of societal political pressure. But the point is, if you look at these questions, they're all interesting, and I don't want to belabor too much and abuse the time. But I would ask you to focus on this last question. This is blood drops. And as I said, these were questions to donors. And you can see that you've got complying and non-complying donors, as we said before. This question was only asked of those donors who reported MSM would follow a policy placing a temporary ban on blood donations if had sexual contact with another man in a 1-year period before donating blood. And in this instance, you can see that a slender majority said yes, they would. A sizable minority said no, they won't. But this, my friends, is something which is cited in the guidance as being one of the justifications for changing the policy. That if the policy was changed, the high levels of non-compliance, which you saw in the previous slide, might actually go down, and we might get a safer blood supply for transfused recipients. I'll come to us later on. So that's some of the inputs. Now, I'm afraid that this slide is slightly misplaced, but it is an important one, and I'll come to the issue later, because I'm going to talk about testing. But this is an extract from a paper of some years ago from Steve Kleinman and other people at the ABB, and the point I wish to make about this is very simple, that the current NAT test is still done on a mini-pool basis for transfused recipients and also for plasma for fractionation. And why the hell, and this is not my question, although he wasn't profane about it, this is a question posed also by Willie Murphy at an excellent talk he gave at the WFH a few months ago, which I suspect he will reiterate this afternoon. Why the hell, for single donor component transfusion, we still use a mini-pool paradigm is beyond me. The technology is there. And you can see that in these breakthrough infections of HIV, in people with basic screening through the mini-pool, which were negative, were shown to be individual NAT positive. So just keep that in mind. Just keep that in mind. Because at the same time, as we've been agonizing over this extremely difficult issue and have come up with a policy which, in my opinion, is totally ineffective, we are still overseeing a screening test paradigm. And see, this is important because everybody says, oh, we've got tests. We've got tests which actually are not working very well because of the way we impose them. And why do we have mini-pools? Let nobody say any more technology. That's not the case. We have mini-pools because of money. Okay.
How long is the window period? 3, 4, 6?
I'll come. I've got a slide which shows exactly that. It's a very crucial point. Now, another couple of comments. And this is very important. Again, this is from drops from Brian's paper. This is definitely the case in most landscapes where it has been scrutinized. Donors are making self-assessments on their safety and their capacity to donate blood irrespective of questionnaires. If they feel that basically they are eligible because they want to do a good thing, they feel they're healthy, they know that their sex life hopefully is not risky, they know they're not shooting drugs and so on, it doesn't matter a damn for many of them what's written in the questionnaire. They will sign and there you go. Because blood donations are screened, I believe it's safe for me to go to give blood, and I would do so regardless of the rules. Very important point. Look at the large level of agreement. An important extract shown again from the FDA guidance is because one of the statements in drops, which I didn't belabor in the previous slide, is that there's a considerable majority which are saying there shouldn't be any selection anyway because of the tests. The FDA is making the statement here. Actually, it's difficult to extract from anywhere the quantitative justification for this, but I presume that they know what they're talking about. I presume that approximately 4-fold increase in HIV transmissions would result if the whole policy were to be scrapped. In other words, whether if a question on MSM is not put into the landscape. All right? Okay. Now, there's another important issue here. The FDA has, in the form of Steve Anderson and other colleagues in their Office of Numbers, whatever it's called, they have a capacity to do risk assessments. And many of us, even I think in this process, have seen many of these risk assessments in things like VCJD and so on. And some years ago, they published this risk assessment, which was an interesting exercise. It was the effect of changing the MSM deferral policy on risk from testing or handling errors. So this isn't as straightforward as you might think. This is from actual inventory management issues, which are important, okay, when you're handling a blood system which delivers, millions of transfusion components every year. And this is what they considered in this risk assessment. But, and again, I emphasize, as a result of issues relating to inventory errors, they determined then that a 1-year deferral, i.e. what we've got now, will increase risk by 3%, and a 5-year deferral would increase risk by 0.5%. Remember, this is against the background, as it was then, that a total ban, MSM 77. Interesting. If you look at the presentations of this, again, the devil's own job to extract them, you will see that they were reasonably based on solid numbers. It is important to always remember that the adverse event reports of the FDA, and I'm not talking about this hemovigilance nonsense, I'm talking about obligatory regulatory reporting, which has been there before the French in their linguistic capacity developed the word hemovigilance. You will see that the vast majority of problems occur at the level of blood collection establishments. There is a relatively modest impetus or burden on this from the plasma industry, but from the blood collection establishment, it's all over the place, and I can assure you, no bloody wonder, someone who's worked with these people. But you can see that we've got several contributing factors with significant inputs. Despite this, and I have not seen any quantitative assessment to back up now this statement in the guidance. It became clear at an FDA workshop held in September 2001 that HIV risk for quarantine release errors has been minimized effectively by increased use of computer inventory management with a remaining small risk of human errors. It's news to me that introducing computers solves any problems anywhere. However, there is no evidence coming from this, none at all. They mention a white paper produced by the ABB on this topic, which describes a number of measures that could be taken, and make the statement that quarantine release errors, basically the FDA is making this statement in order to cover the fact that 5 years before they published a risk analysis which was exactly to the contrary. Exactly to the contrary. And my assertion is that there is no evidence from quantitative analysis from research to doubt that the basis of that risk analysis has changed. People may have a different view. I welcome being made aware of it. Now, coming to the point of Professor Hagen. This is the basic science, okay? You all know these curves. Basically, what we're talking about is what we now call the eclipse, rather than the window period, because the window period is something we developed in relation to NAT, but we know that in terms of the NAT window, the HIV RNA window, we've got something like 10 days. Some people say 9, some people say 12, depends on your study. You pay your money and you make your choice. But at the moment, the HIV RNA window is about 10 days. So that's what we're talking about. In other words, if your infection is as recent as 10 days ago, you can transmit and you won't be picked up by NAT. So let's keep this clear when people talk about we've got tests now. These are the tests we've got. And I reiterate my point about pooling. Okay, so recent infections. So in the guidance, and there were fascinating, I must confess I was totally ignorant of this field. It's always good, even when your scientific brain is aging like mine, to learn something new. In the guidance, they make reference to the concept of HIV recency assays, i.e. modifications, not of NAT, but modifications of the basic serological assays in order to give you a better idea of incidence of infection, which is very recent, which as much as possible obviates the problem of the eclipse. And this is a paper again from Mike Bush. It's a really neat paper showing the principles, and the important thing is that there are now several of these assays, and the FDA brought up a couple of excellent investigators from the I think from the NIH and from the CDC. Anyway, REDS, they're involved in REDS too. And the point is that we have these assays, and these assays have the capacity to a greater or lesser extent to give us estimates of incidence of recent infection, i.e. as much as possible infection in the eclipse period. Okay, read the paper. Again, read the paper. I'm not going to go over this. This is just to show you that there are many types of assays. I want to make a cardinal point. None of these assays, which the FDA is saying they are going to use for monitoring the effectiveness of the introduction of the deferral modification, none of these assays are actually licensed for blood screening. I am astonished. This is the second time in the past 5 years that the agency has adopted a non-regulatorily controlled instrument in a crucial area of oversight. The other one was in their use, and I can remember when I was at the PPA disputing this with Dorothy, in their use of health insurance databases for assessing adverse events for immunoglobulin. It puzzles me. I mean, here's an agency which is based upon law, which has the legal right to exert blood safety in the United States, saying it's going to use instruments which it doesn't actually have any control over. And it's the same with this. None of these are licensed for blood screening. These are all still based upon fairly narrow research type environments. Be that as it may, they are interesting parts of the armamentarium, and perhaps you'd be interested in reading something about them. This is showing the principle of one of them, limiting antigen affinity assay. It hinges, the scientific principle is on the fact that the early infection elicits antibodies, which, although not detectable in the usual HIV test, are not detectable because they are actually of very low avidity. So what you do is you configure a testing platform in which you bind these antibodies, then knock them off, and your testing construct involves a differential readout. And these are now conventionally described in this kind of curve here, and I don't want to get too much into the detail, but the important thing in relation to this curve is that when you look at these results and you derive this probabilistic analysis, you need to have a curve in which this area here, the so-called shadow area here, is as small as possible. So you're looking here as years after seroconversion. We're interested actually in this here. So we want this to be as small as possible. In this particular assay, described in this journal, it's public access plus, excellent public health type journal, you can see that despite manipulating the optical density readouts on the readout machine, the assay isn't terribly great. You still get classified as positive for the early infection. A lot of donors have been infected for a long time. You can make this better. Here's another publication. You can introduce two assays together. In this case, two of these low affinity assays, or you can be, if you've got the time and the money, you can introduce things like CD4 counts in the donors or the patients, and viral loads and so on. Of course, these are much more difficult than straightforward spectrophotometric readouts. And in this particular paper, you don't get much benefit. So you improve the performance of the assay. So the message is these assays exist, they're out there, they are not part of regulated blood safety assays, but they're going to be used by the FDA in monitoring the effectiveness of its action in relation to early HIV infection. Okay. However, this doesn't matter a damn, really, in relation to testing, because irrespective of what platform you have, you cannot escape the inexorable reality of statistical burden. And this was shown by Dr. Brambilla, again, one of the REDS2 investigators at the BPAC. And there are two sets of data here. One of them seeks to show what is the standard error when you are doing incidence estimates in relation to the numbers which you have to look at. So if you look at 10,000 donors, and remember, the background of this is actually a very low incidence of events, you get a standard error of 32. If you have 100,000, you decrease this, and if you look at 1 million donors, then you've got a modest standard error which you can probably live with. Well, that's all very well for the United States blood supply. Good luck, Portugal. Good luck, Finland. Good luck everywhere else. These numbers will never be attained in a normal blood system with a modest population. Another extremely important analysis which Brambilla showed was looking at the actual ability to detect a difference in incidence, i.e. between the two different policies. Let's say we want to detect a difference in incidence between the old policy of never ever and the new policy of once in the past 12 months. Va bene. Okay, so here's the sample size you need for 80% power. Generally in medical statistical analysis, we seek 80% power. If you want to detect an increase in incidence of 50%, i.e. 10 versus 15, so these are not unrealistic types of projections, you need 392,000. If you go for something like, let's say, 20% increase in incidence, which I would predict in many environments would be roughly what you would expect, you need 2 million. Again, good luck, Portugal. Irrespective of what test. There's nothing to do with tests, all right? This is basically the reality of statistics. Okay, having discussed the United States of America, we will discuss the United States of Europe. Now, it's always been the case that the blood directive, we're in Europe, we're more liberal here, it's more democratic, collectivist, socialistic, whatever you want to call it. And so we have never had, at the level of the blood directive, an imposition based upon straightforward specification of sexual preference and a limitation in relation to time. What we've had for permanent deferral, the wording is persons whose sexual behavior puts them at high risk of acquiring severe infectious diseases that can be transmitted by blood, and you can feel the hedging of bets, bursting out of that statement. And for temporary deferral, such as persons whose behavior or activity places them at risk of acquiring defer after cessation of risk behavior for a period determined by the disease in question and availability of the appropriate tests. This is what the directive in its current form requires, and of course the member states are welcome to interpret this, execute their practices, and if they so wish, and this is an important thing, if they so wish, take up a higher standard. This is from a nice paper from Ruth Offergeld at the Robert Koch, many of you know her, published in Vox last year, actually 2 years ago, we're in 2016. And it looks at the situation in the member states, and I've just extracted some data for states who have a permanent MSM deferral, i.e. as was in the States until the FDA's guidance. And this includes France, Germany, Greece. Germany, of course, is important. It's a place where we fractionate a lot of plasma for supply, all right, to this market. And then we've got states, such as my current, and I hope for many years, country of adoption, Italy, and Spain, where there is an effort to interpret the directive in a way that is not based upon sexual preference or time, but based upon actual assessment of risk behavior through the questionnaire. Va bene. A couple of interesting points from this slide. It's interesting, and this is well discussed by Ruth, to compare the proportion of people with MSM subsequently found, generally after the HIV test, with the general population. You'll see that in most environments, there's clearly some evidence of a self-selection. It's generally more or less a bit less than the general population. But remember this, it should be 0, because there's a questionnaire, there's a selection procedure. Interestingly, in Italy, you can see here, and I'll come to Italy in more detail, you can see that the percentage is relatively modest compared to the rest of Europe. I'm very worried about Spain. Look at Spain. The general population is 57%. In blood donors, it's 70%. What does this mean? Is it test-seeking? I don't know. But I'm going to take a couple of case studies purely because there's literature. I mean, it's the best I can do in terms of literature. This is from France, an interesting study. So, as I showed before, in France we have the permanent situation, and the French being the French, they want to be a bit different. So in this particular study, this is from the blood service, they look at the possibility, they model a change in policy to allow donation if you've only had one episode per year. Now, this paper is not actually easy to understand, this paper. It took me some time, and I was reading in the plane again as I was coming in. So they modeled this because there's a source of concern. The percentage of donors in France in these periods of the study which were analyzed is increasing, at the same time as the proportion in the general population is stable. All right? Keep that in mind. Okay, now, they modeled on the basis of 2 scenarios, based upon 2 separate surveys of the population. One in which they surveyed people on the basis of 1 sexual episode, MSM, in the past year, and the other one on the basis of lifetime sexual episodes. In other words, there were these 2 surveys, and they asked different questions. They inputted the data from these surveys into their risk assessment. At the current level of permanent deferral, they estimate that is the residual risk. Mostly on the basis of the, I think, fairly data-poor assumption that introducing the 1 per case, if it's the best case scenario of 1.5% of donors are MSM, would result, as the FDA is hoping, in a decrease in risk because of higher compliance. They found a slight decrease in residual risk with that best case scenario. But it's exquisitely sensitive to what is actually the case. And if the situation mirrors more closely what they call the worst case scenario, which I remind you is an actual survey of the French population, i.e. 4.1% have had MSM sex over the course of their lives, then the risk zooms up. Simple as that. To the best of my knowledge, and Dr. Rossi can correct me, I don't believe that the French have changed their policy. Italy. Italy is different. We are very liberal in Italy, thankfully. And up till 1999, the policy was basically MSM 77. And subsequently, we introduced in Italy the introduction of individual assessment. And I have seen this questionnaire. And it basically asks, through a medical doctor, in Italy you have direct medical interfaces with medically qualified, with physicians actually asking the questions, whether your sexual practices are this, that, or the other. In other words, it doesn't ask you if you've had MSM. It asks you MSM, but other things. For example, heterosexual promiscuity is also a disqualifier. So are other things which have nothing to do with sex. For example, in Italy, if you've gone overseas in the past 4 weeks, you can donate blood, irrespective. Interesting. Anyway, be that as it may, this paper from the journal Blood Transfusion, one of the better journals in the field, came up with the statement that the introduction, and this is one of these many studies, and they were mentioned by Willie, and I'm sure he'll do that again, looking pre and post. And they made the statement on this basis of the study that post didn't make any difference. I disagree. It may not have achieved 0.05 statistical difference, because that is the cutoff, but it's clearly resulted in an increase in the relative risk. It may not be 0.05, the P, but it has increased it. And I'll come to Australia in a second. Okay, however, the important thing is there's another paper from the Italians, not the same group, and this is a paper from Vox, relatively recently, and it looks again at a number of risk behaviors, including MSM, but also because heterosexual promiscuity, which I can't remember how they define it, is included. They look at this. But the important thing about this is very simple. The questionnaire just doesn't work. I mean, if you're going through the enormous investment of having medical doctors and a sophisticated, complicated process in order to select out high-risk behaviors without the crude instrument of MSM 70, so to speak, and to be more sophisticated and hopefully more egalitarian. And then you come up with the fact that you've got people, despite everything being done to explain during this process, thinking that it's not high-risk behavior. People who are admitting, this is, remember, questioning donors who are found to be HIV positive. People who are admitting that they went there to test, to get themselves tested. People not knowing the HIV positivity of the partner. Remember that this is one of the big questions of controversy in MSM. This is worrisome. And now I come again towards the end of my talk by very briefly looking at us. And I was, for many years, the guardian of the Australian policy. Now, in 1996 to 2000, we gradually, gently, I remember this very well, switched from a 5-year to a 1-year deferral. This was not enough. By the grace of God, I had just resigned from my job in late 2008, but I was already the government's representative in the famous Tasmanian High Court case, in which Mr. Kane claimed discrimination because of the 1-year deferral. He was subsequently, it was subsequently rejected, but it gave a lot of visibility. Now, there's a paper, one of the excellent papers by Clive Seed. This forms part of Willie's analysis. If he's not going to talk about it, go on the WFH website of the workshop in October. The slides are there. Fascinating stuff. In this comparison, 5 years prior and the 5 years post at the change revealed again no significant change in HIV positive donors. I draw your attention, big numbers. So this is not unrespectable in terms of the statistical limitations. But there is an increase. It's not statistically significant, but there is an increase. Okay? Now, in a subsequent paper, the Australian Red Cross showed that compliance to this policy is high, over 99%. But let me tell you something. I don't know how many of you are aware of this. Australia, fairly, not uniquely, but fairly rarely in this field, in Australia, in each of the 8 jurisdictions, it is a criminal offense to make a false statement on the donor history questionnaire. You go to jail. It's amazing what speed limits and similar measures do. I don't think any of us are all that careful in relation to giving way on roundabouts and not exceeding the speed by more than 5 kilometers because we have societal principles. I think the fact that we might lose our driving points and get fined a few $100 may play some role in your mind. In Australia, if you make a false declaration, you can go to jail. Keep that in mind.
Yes, but I've never seen
Some-
exceeding speed.
Some years ago, I wasn't there. The Red Cross, on the basis of a massive exercise, which was funded by them, that means it was funded by the taxpayer, produced an epidemiological report, which was used as the basis for asking the TGA to allow them to change the policy again to a 6-month deferral. The TGA did its own analysis, thankfully. They noted that the national data show a 10% increase in newly diagnosed HIV in Australia. This was the largest increase in 20 years. Sorry, but no. Now, I round off with a couple of comments on us. This community, and I'll show a slide on this, has been protected from issues related to viral infection and other pathogens. And it's a damn good job that it's protected, because this community will always be, as long as it is dependent on large pools of biological material like plasma, is always going to be vulnerable, and nothing we can do can change the background reality. When people talk about zero risk, keep in mind that at the background, there's always the jungle. And given that, for absolutely valid reasons, we depend on large plasma pools, this is a paper from Tom Lynch, when he was one of us, and then became one of them, and I was one of them and became one of us. But basically, what this says is that in terms of risk coming from an unknown, undetectable infectious agent or something which is in the window period, in other words, something you cannot test for, you will get very quickly penetration in the plasma pool, and all recipients of plasma derivatives of these products, whether they're hemophilia, whether they're alpha-1, or whether they are PID, they're going to get infected. Why don't we get infected? Because of this. This is simply one of the most neat data sets, but it has a couple of points which I will point out. This is from Mike Susi. It's the bird cohorts followed by the CDC, and we know what it says. But I draw your attention, ladies and gentlemen, that observe that for HIV, although the deferral measures which I showed in the very first slide did such a large amount to cut down the risk of the transfusion recipients, this was the period. We still had infection in our community because we didn't have VI. We stand, fall, gain or lose always by VI. In my opinion, everything else is insignificant. And here's the proof. This is, again, from the CDC's own journal, transfusion-transmitted HIV in the USA in the testing era. These are the window period NAT infections, which I showed you in the earlier slide. It's still happening. Why? Because they don't have viral activation and the tests are limited. And why don't they have viral activation? Because here is just one of the technologies, and I chose this one simply because it's on whole blood. And you can see that by introducing the pathogen reduction technology on blood for transfusion, we can get not as high because of certain limitations, but we can certainly get a huge increase in the viral kill. So why isn't this happening? Why isn't there the same sense of urgency in relation to the introduction of this measure and the same amount of emotional energy deposed to this measure that there was in MSM? Reason is very simple. Costs a lot of money. So if I can come, and I thank you for the patience and attention, to the whole question of MSM and regulatory effort, I think that the deferral policies have clearly, steadily decreased in effectiveness. People at risk are coming to donate more frequently. There is a lot of societal pressure. I do not want to give the impression that I'm giving an anti-MSM message on its basis. But let nobody have any illusion that any of these measures which have been modified in the past few years have not increased the risk to the blood supply. They have. It's as simple as that. Now, the question is society willing to accept this and accept the increase in risk in relation to other things which are also equally important in society, which is the question of gender equality and the question of non-discrimination. These are very important things. It's not just our interests at stake here, but I dispute the position of authorities who say that they are changing the policies on the basis of science and risk. It is not the case. And it ignores the basis of precautionism. We still are based, and I'm in this conservative. I still think that blood safety rests upon several pillars, especially the blood safety of transfusion type components, and I think that donor selection cannot be traded for supposedly higher levels of technological achievement in testing. I think that this is a dangerous principle. It was introduced first in South Africa, where because of obvious racial issues, the previous policy of discarding blood from black donors had to be amended. So this is a huge issue. I mean, this was obviously something which had to happen. But they introduced NAT. Well, an interesting and, in my opinion, dangerous principle. And I reiterate, the only way to address the issue and come closer to the situation for us in this community is to introduce pathogen reduction technology, which is now there. And I would like to see the FDA being more proactive and other regulators being more proactive in the approval of the technologies. But of course, in the end, as we all know, somebody has to pay. Thank you very much for the attention. I'm going to have to go soon. What do you want me to do, Willie?
I'm going to ask
You've
you,
got 15 minutes.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you one or two questions. So, because what I want is to try and inform subsequent discussions after you're gone, which you'll not be able to contribute to. So I'm going to exercise the privilege now and ask you one or two questions. One is, what risk are we addressing? What is the danger in changing the MSM? So
HIV infection.
just HIV.
I know that there is wording in relation to the FDA's guidance about newly emerging infections, blah, blah, blah. I take it relatively with a pinch of salt. I see no evidence that in the past, I mean, you look at what we've seen in the past, let's say, 10, 15 years. What have been the emerging infections? We've had an infection vehicled by eating beef. And we've had some other infections vehicled through mosquitoes. I don't believe that sexual lifestyle is going to impact on that, and I think that the FDA talking about emerging infections in relation to the MSM community is inappropriate. Just as incidentally, I had a big laugh at the statement in the guidance which said, actually now, we're not deferring hemophiliacs anymore because of risk of viruses, because as donors, because you see, there's no longer any risk of viruses. We are deferring hemophiliacs because we're afraid that when they are venipunctured, they will bleed. Yeah. Can you believe it? That's all I can say in relation to that question.
Okay.
What about HCV?
What about it?
Is it included in a high risk?
I mean, we've got measures for HCV, but I think the focus in relation to MSM has been HIV. I mean, I know that there is data for the epidemiology of HCV infection also in the MSM community, but I haven't really researched it all that much.
The village in Denmark from way past before inactivation, there was an increased risk for them to have HCV.
Yeah, of course. Of course. We all had this risk. And no amount of questioning or testing changed it. What changed it was viral activation.
Well, Albert, you did make the point. Sorry.
Can we go to Southwell's go first, the ladies first?
Oh, all right.
Thank you, Bob.
You sexist.
I'll get over this.
Albert, If you claim that PRT have to be introduced for the transfusion sector, that means that, and you stated it, that testing is the safety key for fractionation.
No, I said viral activation is the safety key for
Yeah.
fractionation.
Yes, viral inactivation through the process of plasma products.
Mhm.
So that's what I mean. What is the impact of changing a little something in the donor pool, or in the donor population? Because if you believe that the viral inactivation through the process is
perhaps I know what you're saying. I know what you're saying. Perhaps I need to pitch my words more carefully. I am not suggesting that for the plasma sector, I mean, irrespective of the whole problem of confusion because of recovered plasma, I'm not at all suggesting that for the plasma sector through the source plasma, which is what most of the supply comes from, we can do away with selection or testing. That's not my point. I don't want to give that implication. However, I do believe that the capacity to, as was said in a famous review, which I believe this man was part of, kill all known germs, can play a role in our decision-making in relation to some of the panic-stricken measures which come about as soon as there's a new chikungunya or Ebola or whatever. I think this can give us a measure of assurance and allow us to be more rational in terms of certain blood safety measures. I don't believe that it is possible to roll back the clock to the extent of obviating everything except PRT, and no, I don't think it's desirable anyway, because there's still going to be the possibility of GMP failures at the plasma manufacturing side, and I'm aware that these have happened, so we need to be very careful. But I do think that having that huge pillar and that huge barrier coming from the actual killing of anything which goes in is a huge source of comfort.
Yeah, but I mean, we will trust that. It's just the proportion.
I'm working on it.
We'll discuss that later.
Okay. Bob.
Well, I think it's the same point as Francois, but so I think you've answered that, you know, in a sense.
Also, there's the question, quite frankly, which the FDA did bring up, that you don't want risky blood coming into the facility and risking the workers and the other donors.
But if you make the assumption that, and I'm just trying to clarify my own mind here, if you make the assumption that there isn't a problem with HIV for all the reasons, you know, there's a couple of 100,000 donations from MSM donors in the US already entering the plasma.
Yes.
You mean fractionated?
Yeah, but who said that there isn't a? The FDA has estimated, the FDA estimates, I can't remember, Mark Skinner might remember, in the BPEC, the FDA, Alan stated that they think that there are about at least 5 breakthroughs which they're not detecting. Remember that the capacity of the system, despite all the posturing by the hemovigilantes in relation to the possibility of detection of infection post-transfusion is zilch. Everybody wants to count the number of bugs in a bag, but nobody actually wants to fork out the cash to monitor patients.
I'm going to take Brian and then Carrie.
Albert, you focus on HIV. What's your
That's
level,
what I was asked,
okay,
MSM.
okay, well, no, but what's your level of concern about a new virus which will have a long incubation period, during which time the person is relatively well?
Yeah, that is why we need the PRT, because that's the only barrier. I do not see evidence, I do not think, this is where I think that there's a discriminatory, possible discriminatory posture. I do not see any evidence that the MSM community is at higher probability of transmitting a newly emerging infection. The evidence we have is that we are copying newly emerging infections from things which are much, much bigger than sexual practice in these individuals, and which we should be doing something about anyway.
Can I just answer that? I'm going to, and Billy Albert isn't going to be here, I'm going to present a slide that shows over the next 20 years there's an 8% risk that a new infection, insidious infection, will emerge from the MSM community. I'll share that with you later. But it's probably wrong, but it's at least a,
Well,
it's a reasonable
look,
guess and nobody else has
let's
done it.
communicate. We might be, I intend to write this up. Maybe we can do it together.
Okay, Carrie.
Thank you. Good talk. Very simple question. What could be done to improve the self-referral, which is based on your talk, critical element there?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's a very good question. I don't know.
Because it's a regulation.
I do not know. I believe strongly that in the ethical, altruistic blood environment in which most of these landscapes operate, donors are genuinely committed to doing a good thing for its own sake. Okay? It's not the only thing in their minds, but it is in their minds. And yet we see that despite all the educative effort, and I tell you, in Italy we spend huge resources in making sure we have donor interviews and explanations and materials. Despite this, people say, yes, but I know it's not me. And I don't know. For that, you need sociologists. Not one of them.
But what you're saying, when you talk about the self-referral, I think it's a very important tool, but I believe it's completely neutralized by the fact that you have a higher number of test seekers in the population, and as long as we have test seekers, that takes away immediately the argument of
I think Jan Bolt has made a good point. In some environments, that's certainly the case, and I think it needs to be countered by making sure that donors don't have to go to donate, that people don't have to donate to learn their status in a confidential fashion. I can tell you, many years ago, in fact, in 1985, when the tests came out, I was the head of the blood service in a European member state, in the smallest one. And the Minister of Health, in his infinite foolishness, declared that the only area which was going to be funded for HTLV3 testing, because it was thought that Malta didn't have any people practicing high-risk behaviors, was going to be the blood bank. Subsequent events in relation to questionnaires revealed very interesting results. In other words, people came
for testing.
And I think they always will, because it's easy. You don't have to tell your wife I'm going down to the MSM testing clinic when you come home from a trip to Scouts for 10 minutes.
It's difficult to construct an alternative which is as innocent as the blood bank.
It's always good.
I want to ask a question, and I don't know the answer. You might find it a stupid question, but how often are donors, normal donors, not MSM donors, but donors tested?
Every time they donate.
Yeah. Sorry?
Every time they donate.
Time.
Yes.
So
they're questioned and they're tested every time they donate.
Okay, now what happens if, for example, a woman gives a donation, but unbeknown to her, her husband has been, not very honest with her and has picked up.
You saw, the Italian data shows you, they don't know. They don't know. This is one of the cruxes of the argument around the whole question of fidelity. And I've only had one partner, and so on. But the reality is that people lie. This also comes out in the blood drops papers. I think it's very difficult. This is an issue which for people like me, and I think you know, the people who know me know I'm not a supporter of Mr. Trump or Senator Cruz, okay? But for people like me, this is an agonizing issue and has been all the time. How do you stop yourself from being boxed into the rabid, discriminatory environment? It's a bit like global warming. How do you stop yourself from being dragged into the right-wing lunatics? But we have to try to base it upon the facts. And I think one of the facts is we are not alone in the world. We have to accept that there are people who have rights. We have to discuss this together. I think there have been many notable advances in this compared to this situation. I'm an Australian. We had tragic situations in Australia with the gay community barricading the blood banks and all this kind of stuff. That's behind us. But I do say, and I'm going to say this once again, I do not believe, and I will never accept, that it's a human right to donate blood irrespective of your risk status. Never.
Mark, last comment before Albert comes out the door.
Yeah, so I'm giving a talk this afternoon. It's unfortunate Albert's not here.
Indeed it is. But I'll give you my slides if you give me yours.
Although a lot of my personal opinions are not necessarily on my slides. In terms of the donor history questionnaire, I think it's a bit of an inflammatory statement to say donors lie. And it was not the blood drop study, it was a prior CDC study where they actually did a donor cognitive questionnaire. And the conclusion of the CDC was not that donors lie, but that actually donors go through an abundance of decision-making that they are actually trying to be helpful, and they are over-interpreting the questionnaire with the goal of saying, I know, no, I mean, as I teased it out through a rather extensive study, and it's a separate published paper that the blood drops study quoted from, is that they are actually get it. They understand that their blood needs to be safe, that their behavior affects blood safety, and that they think they know what the question is asking. So instead of answering a literal question, they're actually trying to be helpful. And so it's not that their intention, because I think lying has an intent piece with it, that they are actually not understanding the importance of answering the literal question, but they're actually trying to be helpful. So the conclusion was that more needs to be done around the donor history questionnaire, and that, but even to your point, in the belts and suspenders approach, where we have the donor history questionnaire as one of the pieces, it still is a relatively small contributor to the overall safety. So even if we improve the DHQ process, it's not going to make a huge impact.
I don't dispute anything you said, and I think that my words were somewhat unfortunate. Look, I had, as Mark and Johan know, I had a flight booked for 7 o'clock, but apparently TP Portugal is not doing very well, and they cancelled the late flight that they have to Rome. So I've got to go. I commend your